Good evening, everyone. Depending on how late in the evening it is for all of you, if you're on the West Coast like I am, on the East Coast like some of my colleagues, wherever you are, thank you for joining us. My name is Alicia Pedowitz. I am the Director of Teen Education at Moving Traditions. And I'd like to share with you just a little bit of my own personal background and experiences that I know that I am bringing to this really important conversation tonight and why I am excited to have it. Before I began working at Moving Traditions, I for many years was part of a program called BJE March of the Living, taking Jewish teens from Los Angeles on a trip to Poland and Israel to understand how the Holocaust really is part of our shared journeys as Jews, our story. Since that time, I have been dedicated to really helping young people understand how anti-Semitism and also various other forms of hatred can show up in our day-to-day and become much bigger issues. I know that is something I bring to this conversation. I'm also the parent of two teenagers here in Los Angeles, a fairly progressive community that we're part of. And I know that I am constantly trying to think about how is anti-Semitism showing up for them? How does it intersect with the other things that they care about and are part of? And how do I help them talk about it? So I am personally very excited to learn from all of our speakers here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Analik. I'm the Fellowship Director for the Meyer Gottesman Kolkolenu Teen Feminist Fellowship. And I have 8 years of experience as an educator working with Jewish teens in a couple of Moving Traditions programs, Rosh Hodesh and also Kolkolenu. And I'm also bringing my identity as a third-generation Holocaust survivor. My grandmother, Erna Analik, who was from Uzhgorod, Czechoslovakia, survived with the help of a German citizen. And the Holocaust and anti-Semitism were topics that I often thought about growing up. And in my work with teens, I often think about and wrestle with this question of what does it mean? What does it look like to strive for and keep that promise of never again at a time when we have fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors with us today?
Thank you, Jen. For everyone who's joining us, we actually invite you to sit for a moment and reflect on what it is personally that you are bringing to this conversation. Why does it matter to you? And how does that make you feel? One of the things that we often talk about in our work with teens is that when we come as adults, as parents, as educators, to sitting with teens on particularly hard conversations, we need to be aware of what we personally bring to it and how we feel about it, so we can be ready to sit there in support of them and how they are feeling. On that note, I'd like to share a little bit about Moving Traditions for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We foster for Jewish teens connections, interpersonal connections, interpersonal connections, communal connections with the larger Jewish community at a time when we know that teens need a sense of connection more than ever. We do this through fostering 3 key outcomes for the teens in our programs. We can go to the next slide. Those outcomes are based on three core Jewish values: shleimut, or helping support Jewish youth pursue a sense of personal knowledge and personal wholeness. Can we go back one slide, please? Also a sense of hesed, of committed, caring connections with one another and again with their community, and also supporting teens in their pursuit of tzedek, of justice in the world around them. We believe that these 3 things are interconnected. They show up in various ways in the work that we do, and they are going to be the background for all of the ways we're talking about supporting teens tonight. A little bit about our programs. Like I said, we work with Jewish institutions, perhaps your local Jewish institutions, by partnering on a few of our programs, including our B Mitzvah family education program, our Kulam curriculum for educators to plug and play into their institutions and into their classrooms to explore teen sense of self, the relationships, and their communities. We also partner with institutions to bring our teen programs, Rosh Chodesh, Shevet, and Selem, which are affinity group spaces based on gender identity for youth to explore who they are and who they want to be in the world in the face of all kinds of things that are relevant to teens today. And we also have teen leadership programs. And the Meyer Gottesman Kol Kolenu Teen Feminist Fellowship, which again, one of our panelists and co-moderator, Jen, is the director of. And one of our other panelists is my colleague, Becky Berger, who directs Kumi and Anti-Oppression Teen Leadership Experience, which is our newest program about to launch. And we are going to be bringing tonight some of the wisdom from their work in those programs in supporting teens who are focused on making change in the world and how anti-Semitism impacts them and how they want to talk about it. And finally, we also think a lot at Moving Traditions about the larger ecosystem of support for Jewish youth. And that includes all of you, that includes educators at institutions that we partner with. And in supporting that ecosystem, we have our Culture Shift program. It's a training initiative for staff who work with Jewish youth at camps and other youth serving organizations. And finally, what we are here for tonight, part of our Raising Up Teens with Moving Traditions webinar series. So thank you for being here in support of teens in this conversation, which, as I said, is really how we want to be grounded and centered here tonight. I mentioned at the start our philosophy, our approach to teen wellness, supporting their whole sense of self, supporting the way they interact with one another and are supported by others around them, and also supporting them in their journeys to make a better world through pursuit of tzedek, through issues they care about. All of these things we know when we think about teens, when we think about this generation that's known as Gen Z, what motivates them? What do they value? They value all of these things. They value authentic conversations with people they trust, all of us. They value thinking about how diversity and different identities and perspectives show up and can be valued. And they also really care about supporting one another. So we bring all of those understandings to say how and why does it matter that we're going to talk to teens about anti-Semitism in a way that is supportive of them. And the one other thing before I turn it over to Jen that I want to ask you to hold tonight is what we said at the start about thinking about what we each are bringing to this conversation. When we show up as parents into conversations with our kids, I can say this as a parent of teens, I know that sometimes we have to think about which hat we are wearing. Are we in this conversation as our kids' advocate, as their supporter, right? As a sounding board as they work through things for themselves. And we want to also ask you in these conversations, how are you showing up to them? And why does it matter to the teens that you're talking about? So again, think about what you're bringing here, and I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Alicia. So anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism can be a challenging topic to talk about. I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about why it might be challenging for some folks. So a few reasons. Can we see the slide, please? The first one is that these conversations can feel high risk. So we might fear that talking about anti-Semitism will lead to conflict or disagreement. And for many of us who fear conflict, we might go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, losing access to our thinking brains or wise minds. Another reason might be these conversations are high stakes. When we talk about anti-Semitism, we are often holding concerns about our children's or students' safety, as well as possibly existential questions about the Jewish people. And third, these conversations can be challenging on an identity level. Anti-Semitism can be a polarizing topic, and our ideas and perspectives can feel synonymous with who we are. So there's a lot to lose if we even consider another point of view. So similar to how when adults are talking about sex with teens, it's important to model comfort with topics like bodies, pleasure, and consent. The same idea is true with anti-Semitism. We want to strive to model comfort with the topic of anti-Semitism to support teens, even when we don't see eye to eye with them. And to help us get there, we have a few invitations for all of you. Let's go to the next slide. We invite you to notice and acknowledge any discomfort that comes up for you, to keep the goal of supporting young people at center of mind, and visit other people's opinions. We've brought various experts to the conversation tonight who each have different frameworks for thinking about anti-Semitism to help us see the larger sphere of conversations your teens may be navigating. You might not agree with all of them, or all the speakers. That's okay. Try on their perspective. And the last thing I want to say before introducing our first panelist is we're not going to cover everything, but I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I am delighted to welcome our first panelist, who is Rabbi Diana Fursko. Rabbi Fursko was previously one of my colleagues at Moving Traditions, and she has a book coming out on the very topic of anti-Semitism. Rabbi Fursko, could you start by sharing what are you bringing to this conversation?
Sure. I mean, first, I just have to say, I worked at Moving Traditions for only a brief time, but I think it's safe to say it's having a lifelong impact on me. So it's really an honor for me to be here with my colleagues and my friends. A few things. I think, I've been a congregational rabbi for 10 or 15 years now, and I've been talking about anti-Semitism on and off the bima for that time. And the more I talked about it, the more people talked to me about it. They reached out and they had questions, and any congregational rabbi will tell you that some of the best conversations happen in the hallways, on the way out the door, when you're going, on the way to a meeting or something like that. And congregants over time would stop me and ask me these incredible, powerful, confusing questions about anti-Semitism. Things like, why would people voluntarily be wearing the yellow star? Or, what do you think is happening on college campuses? Is it okay to send my kid to whatever school is in the news this week? Or, topics having to do with race and anti-Semitism, all sorts of questions. And what I found is that I could not answer their questions in the hallway quickly. So instead, in many ways, I'm writing this book to answer those questions. I'm trying to be a pragmatist and deal with people's real concerns in real time about what anti-Semitism looks like today. And then the second sort of reason that I'm here is because during the Black Lives Matter protests, someone took a baseball bat to the door of my synagogue and hit it several times. I don't know if it was an outright act of anti-Semitism or if it was anti-Semitism at all, if it was part of an expression of anger about racial injustice. I'll never know. But for me, sort of staring at the broken glass of my house of worship really emotionally regressed me to thinking about all of the broken glass due to the anti-Semitism of the past. And that was the moment I decided to write this book. And that was the moment I decided to dedicate myself to making sure nobody else had to look at their own synagogue being desecrated. So those are sort of the things I'm bringing with me tonight.
What a powerfully disturbing image, that broken glass.
Yeah, it really was.
So we came here to talk about teens, and I'm curious to hear from you. Why do you think it's important that we talk about anti-Semitism with teens?
Okay, I think it's, first of all, not just important, but I would say urgent. So I'm a millennial, and I'm sure many of the people on this call are as well. And if you grew up like I did, then you were on what we call, a fairly good vacation from anti-Semitism. You probably knew about anti-Semitism. You heard about it from an older generation. You maybe watched movies about it. You went to museums about it. You were educated about it, but mostly in the sense of history. It was something that happened before. But the reason I think it's urgent to talk with teens is because now anti-Semitism is not something you look at, it's something that's looking right at teens. So they experience it at school, they experience it on social media, of course, and they're very aware of it in the news. So I think anti-Semitism's resurgence is what makes it so urgent. And I also think the nature of anti-Semitism is extremely confusing. So that's why it's important to talk about, because it is complicated. Sometimes it's extremely obvious and it's a swastika, and sometimes it's just a feeling. So that's why it's very important to be there for our teens in all the ways that we can.
What you just mentioned is really important about that. We don't always know what anti-Semitism is. We know that that's something that teens are asking that question. What is anti-Semitism and how can we identify it? I'd love for you to share what framework you like to use, framework or definition, to talk about anti-Semitism, and why do you find that framework helpful?
Okay, so it's interesting. I mean, I know many of the people on this call are Jewish educators and know that even within the Jewish world, we have many different opinions on the definitions of anti-Semitism. I'll explain it like this. To me, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. Like many conspiracy theories, it has all different prongs. And the sort of core of it is that Jews are conspiratorial, working together, and controlling the banks or the weather or races or classes or politics. And it's a very simple worldview that basically paints the Jews as villains and everyone else as the victim. You can sort of pick the largest societal problem in any time, project that problem onto the Jews, and that's how anti-Semitism works. Like I said, I'm a pragmatist, so I like the definition that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs put forward, which was that anti-Semitism is not allowing Jews to exist collectively the way we allow others to exist collectively. I like that because, I'm on the ground every day with the Jewish community, and I think it works on a micro level. I've seen that happen in people's place of work where they want an affinity group, and there are lots of other affinity groups, and the administration or the supervisor says basically like, no, the Jews can't have an affinity group for one reason or another. And I've seen that definition work on a more macro level when people talk about Israel and we sort of don't allow it to exist in the same way we allow other countries to exist. So for me, his definition is the most useful framework.
Thank you. So Israel, this brings up another question that teens are wrestling with. So teens are navigating this question: when does criticism of Israel cross into anti-Semitism, and when doesn't it? How do you think about that?
I think about it in two ways. One, I just look at the impact. At this point, I frequently don't bother giving like a factual defense for Israel when somebody is criticizing Israel. I don't bring up points that I think would help to quote like win an argument. Instead, I think about what is the impact of your speech or your actions? Who does it affect? Does it affect Israelis? Does it affect Palestinians? Or does it affect Jewish Americans? And if it's the last one, if it negatively impacts Jewish Americans, then you're probably not doing what you think you're doing, and you're probably contributing to anti-Semitism. So rather than get into an entire debate about Israel, I focus on the outcome. of the Israel debate. And then just for people listening, I'll refer you to Natan Sharansky's work. He put forward what he called the 3D test, which is double standard, demonize, and delegitimate. And if you're doing either of those things, he argued about Israel, he would argue that it veers into anti-Semitism. So that might be a helpful framework for people as well.
Helpful tool, the 3Ds. Thanks. So the last question I have for you is, what suggestions would you give to parents or adults on how to help teens who experience anti-Semitism? 3
things. One is what you said in the beginning. All those basic parenting skills still apply to this. Listen, 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 validate, 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 and then learn for yourself. Read books about anti-Semitism, find really good online resources. Like everyone on this call, myself included, could probably learn more about Jewish history, Jewish identity, and anti-Semitism. I also believe we all need to show up Jewishly in non-Jewish spaces. So what I mean by that is, wear kippah at work, wear a Jewish star necklace, let your kids know that it's okay and even necessary to be Jewishly visible, especially at this moment. And I think together, if we really listen to our teens, if we can validate their experiences and learn from their experience and model the way we want them to behave, that we can fight back against this truly awful hate.
Thank you so much, Diana. So glad that you're here. I'm gonna pass it back to Alicia to introduce our next panelist.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Diana. I know in talking with teens, in the work that I do as an educator with my own teens, when I have frameworks in mind that I can use to help me think about how do I navigate this conversation? What are we talking about? How do I help them? It makes a huge difference. So I'm already walking away, Diana, with a few different frameworks to think about. Thank you. Rabbi Frisco, I apologize. I am excited to bring our next panelist to again help us think about some different frameworks that we can apply in how we talk with teens. Oren Jacobson from Project Shema. His bio is in the chat, along with, we'll be putting a link to Project Shema. I highly encourage you all to check it out. They're doing some incredible work. But I'm just going to dive right into the conversation with you, Oren. Can you share with us a bit about what you are bringing to this conversation and what you bring to talking about anti-Semitism and how and why it matters to you?
Sure, Lisa, happy to. And Rabbi, it's good to see you. Can't wait to read your book. And it's nice to be with all of you. So by way of background, my grandfather is one of the 3% of Polish Jews from his hometown to survive World War II. He came from a town called Lublin, Poland, which some of you may be familiar with. There were 40,000 Jews in Lublin, Poland before the war. For context, I'm in Chicago, or just outside of Chicago, and there's a very famous building in Chicago that the Chicago Cubs play baseball in that many people have heard of, called Wrigley Field. For any of you Yankees or Red Sox fans, I'm sorry for insulting you with a reference to Wrigley, but I'm in Chicago, so we're going with my hometown, and by the way, I'm a White Sox fan, so let's not tell my father that I'm talking about Wrigley here, but most of us know what it's like to be inside of a place like that, right? Like a baseball stadium, an amphitheater surrounded by literally tens of thousands of people in your community. And Wrigley can host 40,000 people, which is effectively the entire town of Lublin, Poland. We know what it's like to be in a place like that, surrounded by that noise and that energy and that vibrancy. And I want you to imagine with me, if you can, what it would be like to be inside of a place like Wrigley Field with fewer than 1,200 people. And how empty that space would be, and how quiet and lonely and desolate it would feel. My grandfather is one of fewer than 1,200 from his hometown to survive World War II. So I have, because of that reality, dedicated my life to 2 major things. The first has been to stand up for our community, which obviously means addressing anti-Semitism. And the second has been to stand up for all those who are attacked for the basic crime of being who they are in this country. And that actually is what drove me into what we call progressive organizing or social justice activism in the country. I helped to build what is now the largest leadership development organization in the broader progressive movement. 8 years ago, I started an organization that we continue to run, focus on bringing male identifying allies into the fight to protect and expand abortion rights in this country. And by the way, with that program, we have a youth college training program to train young men to be allies and organizers to bring other men into the work. And I do all those things as someone who wears a kippah in public, to the rabbi's point about showing up as a Jew. I'm visibly Jewish everywhere I go. And I've worked with activists and organizers from the progressive movement across this country, including, by the way, leading Men for Choice now with a woman who is one of the founding members of the Women's March. And I'm sure everybody here is well familiar with the challenges that came up around the Women's March and anti-Semitism. And so the lens that I carry into this conversation, and potentially the unique value add that I can offer into this conversation, is heavily skewed by and informed by what it means to be a Jew who is showing up in justice movements for causes for justice in this country, who also has an affirmative relationship, although a complicated relationship, especially right now, with the state of Israel. And understanding what it means to navigate those spaces, showing up fully as who I am, which is a challenge for many. And certainly when it comes to teenagers, I know a lot of what they're seeing on social media. I just got done spending 3 days in a Jewish high school here talking with Jewish students. And certainly when kids are getting onto college campuses, they're experiencing a lot of stuff around the Israel conversation in particular that can be uncomfortable, they feel unprepared for, and at times it is actually anti-Semitic. And so I come into this space as somebody who I think in many ways is walking through the world in ways that many of our young future leaders are walking through the world, socially conscious, socially aware, caring about causes for justice in this country, having a relationship with Israel, and struggling to hold all those things in tension with each other.
I think to that, that last point, as you said, that walking through the world in a way that we know many of our young people are. I just wanted to reference back to something we were talking about at the start, right? One of the things that we know when we look at this, kind of like characteristics of this generation of Gen Z, who are the teens that we're talking about. Individual teens may hold their own individual beliefs, but generationally, some of the trends are many of the things that you were just talking about, right? Caring about justice for all people, understanding that people hold a multitude of identities and how those intersect, wanting to respect those, show up in justice movements for those, while also showing up for themselves. And as you really talked about, like one of the ways that, and thinking about this as a teen well-being standpoint, is how do we help those teens who are holding all those complicated things be in some of the spaces that you're talking about, do the work that they care about, that they believe in, while also saying like, hey, who I am and where I come from is also perhaps being impacted, and how do I kind of hold all of those different truths and do it in a way that is true to this and to this. So I'm grateful for you for doing the work that you do and for being here. And on that note of kind of a multitude of identities and understanding that, I know that Project Shema has a really great resource, which we're going to share on the screen. It will also be included. I mentioned in the chat, we're going to share all the resources we share tonight with all of you afterward. I'm wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about, again, the framework that you use to think about identifying anti-Semitism, navigating anti-Semitism from that standpoint. I'm going to draw everyone's attention to the left side of this graphic with the binoculars and the iceberg. Oren, can you talk us through a little bit about how this applies to thinking about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, and actually, could I ask that we pull it down for a quick second? Let me lay some context to it, and then we'll pull it back up. So one of the things that is central to the diagnosis at Project Shema that informs all of our work are what we call the 4 interlocking problems that enable anti-Jewish ideas often to go unnoticed and unchecked. And they're actually really simple, powerful concepts, and it informs that guide, and we'll come back into that guide in a second. The first is that most people don't actually know what it means to be a Jew. meaning they don't understand what Jewish identity is. The second is they don't understand what anti-Semitism is. And if you don't understand what it means to be Jewish, then you can't understand what anti-Semitism is. The third is that most people don't know how anti-Semitism works, especially within the way that we think about systems of power and oppression in this particular country or the broader Western world. And the fourth is that often our perspectives are less trusted because vis-a-vis other minority groups, especially white presenting Jews, people who look like me, are in a position of relative privilege to other minority groups in this country right now. So those four problems, again, are that people don't know what it means to be a Jew, people don't know what anti-Semitism is, people don't know how anti-Semitism works, and our perspectives are often less trusted. So with that, let's put that thing back up on screen, because the resource which everybody here is going to get sort of follows that basic framework, and it's designed as an easy tool for you or an easy tool for your teenage students to think about how to communicate this to other people as well. And so the first graphic that you see on the left-hand side is who/what are the Jews? What does it mean to be Jewish? And on the left-hand side of that graphic, you see these binoculars zooming in. And what people see, especially in America, is that Jews are a white religious group, right? That we're a white religious group, AKA we're effectively Protestants or Catholics or evangelicals. We just pray on a different day and a little bit differently, and we don't accept Christ as our Lord and Savior. Now, this is really problematic on two levels. The first is that obviously the Jewish community is very diverse, right? 15 to 20% of Jews in America would be identified as Jews of color. The majority of Jews in Israel obviously are not white identified, not to say that Jews in Israel use American racial constructs for their identities. But beyond that, Jews aren't simply a religious group. And this is where the second element of that graphic comes into play with, which is this iceberg analogy, this iceberg image, right? And above the waterline, what you see at the tip of the iceberg is your skin color and the fact that there is a religious component to our community. But obviously, Jewish identity is far richer and more complex than simply the basic idea of being religious, right? Jews have identified as part of a people or a nation or an ethnic group with a cultural national connection for literally thousands of years longer than what we've come to understand as modern organized religion, right? We have a shared history, a shared culture, a shared language, shared food, right? All of the things that we associate with an ethnic group. And so it's really critical to recognize that most people just don't understand Jewish identity. And so they quickly sort of label us into largely a religious community that is white, when on both of those dynamics, it actually badly misidentifies and misdefines who and what Jews are, right? We derive from the tribes of Israel, right? And Israel being a person. Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. Even the word Jewish doesn't derive from Judaism. It derives from the word Yehudi, of or from Judea, right? A tie to the land. And so it's really important to start with that basic concept of Jewish identity, because Jewish identity does not fit neatly into Western identity frameworks because it predates Western identity. And anti-Semitism doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of systems of power and oppression in the Western world in particular, because anti-Semitism predates the Western world. But people are judging and perceiving us through the mental models that they have. And by the way, I should name and state, this includes members of our community using those external frameworks with which to understand themselves. And so I think that's really important, an important place to start, which is why we always start our conversations around anti-Semitism with Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups, with an exploration of Jewish identity to ground the conversation.
That's really helpful. It's making me think about, again, the way that we often start in thinking, helping teens first think about the self, the shleimut, right? Being grounded in who am I? How do I see myself and understand myself? Then in order to use that to interact with others. There's so much more I would love for us to talk about. I want to say to the folks who are watching, we are going to share that guide as well as some of the guiding questions that you could use with the teens in your life to look at that and start to kind of go through that process with them to be able to use that to then talk about how am I seeing anti-Semitism? How do I want to talk about it with others, as well as being really grounded in who am I and where am I coming from? Oren, I want to give you one last question. Anything else that you think is important for the parents or other adults on this conversation as like one take home? What's important for talking with teens in your lives right now?
So I think it's really easy to be a young Jewish person in the world today, especially in America. And let's set the context, right? America is the strongest nation that's ever existed. Jews in diaspora in America are as accepted as we've ever been in any diasporic situation. And so it's really easy as a young person in America to look at the relative position and privilege of many Jews in this country vis-a-vis our friends, our Black friends, our brown friends, our Muslim friends, our queer friends. And then to hear older folks in our community talking about anti-Semitism and the risks of anti-Semitism, and for that to feel really disconnected, meaning my Black friends are getting pulled over in every interaction with the police officer is a life or death situation. What are you so worried about? We're safe, we're fine. I think it's really easy to process that and to see that and to hear especially the elder statesmen of our community. I'll put myself into that at 40, talking about these issues. I'm not really quite the elder statesman, but I'm also not a teenager. And at Project Shema, we're focused on the question of collective risk, not individual risk. And if you think about anti-Semitism on an individualized level, then certainly the American Jewish community has a lot less to worry about day in, day out than other minority groups in this country. The math is pretty straightforward on that. We need to understand, and our young people need to understand anti-Semitism through a collective lens and a collective framework, which is the question of how do the worst things that ever happened to Jews happen to Jews? And the answer to that question is that Jews have become isolated in a society and cleaved off from all other groups in a society. And unfortunately for us, skin color and status, economic or otherwise, have not prevented collective systemic violence targeting Jews. And that is true in society after society, era after era. But it can be really easy to sit here in America today, and I hope that we are past those problems, but it can be really easy to sit here in America today as a young person, feel incredibly safe, listen to our parents and our grandparents and feel like those voices are hyperbolic. And because of our history, because of how collective anti-Semitism has threatened Jews, it's really critical to recognize that neither skin color nor status, political, economic, or social, have protected Jews when those societies have turned and sought a scapegoat to blame for the problems of those societies. Jews have often been an easy target, which is why the isolation and cleavage of Jews from all groups, dominant and marginalized, creates a systemic risk for our community.
Thank you very much for that. And it's gotten me thinking about the important, right? What is the reverse of isolation? It is building our relationships and our connections beyond ourselves, which thank you again, Oren. And I think that is a great segue into our next voice on the panel, our next panelist, Becky Berger, who, as I said at the start, is my colleague and the director of our just now about to launch brand new program, Kumi, an anti-oppression team leadership experience. There's a link to that in the chat if you want to learn more about that program. But Becky, I want to ask what you're bringing to this conversation.
First of all, thank y'all so much for being here as a part of this important conversation. It's so necessary in this moment. So if you had asked me maybe an hour ago, I might have answered this question slightly different, but hearing sort of everyone talk about their family's connection and survival of the Holocaust, I think about the fact that I sit here right at the intersection of being a first generation American. My father was born in a refugee camp in Italy after the Holocaust. My grandparents were survived in the ghetto in Kovno in Lithuania. But I'm also a survivor of American enslavement, right? My mother's family, we can sort of trace through slavery in the South. And so, right, I sit here at this intersection of like lots of different types of oppression, but also resilience and survival. And so much of that sits in the work that I do and that I want to offer to young people in the ways of like, what does it mean to do and to survive and to do it with joy and liberation and excitement. And so wanting to do that with an eye towards how do we talk about the difficult stuff, because that's what keeps us here, and that's what helps us get through.
Thank you for sharing that of yourself and of what brings you here. And I'm going to jump to that, that last piece that you said about wanting to talk with the teens about the difficult stuff and also experiencing joy, right? I'm seeing some questions in the chat around like really concrete ways that we can think about talking with our teens. As a teen educator, as someone who is doing some of that really hard work and doing both of the things that you mentioned, what have you found to be useful as a framework for talking with the teens you work with about anti-Semitism and how they can show up within that?
Yeah, so I like to approach when we're, in my work, I do a lot of talk about all different sorts of oppression. And so I like to give a solid framework of like, how do we understand oppression in general, right? And so we use this framework that Oren actually sort of mentioned around like this idea of prejudice plus power, right? So the idea that oppression is someone disliking you for something immutable, something you can't change, plus the ability to do something about that or stop you from doing something, right? And that the combination of those two things is how we see oppression play out. And the reason that that's useful is because it can help us see what is happening in the moment, not just like what is happening, but how it's happening, why it's happening, and who the actors are. When we start to think not just about like people disliking us or doing harmful things, but sort of like, how is that change happening, or why is it happening, or who is in control of that, it becomes really important. And, I think about that in a piece of like, we often talk about anti-Semitism in terms of stereotypes around like Jews having control, but the way we often see that play out is in sort of like the world around us, in this idea of like middlemaning and scapegoating, right? So we can look at the places that Jews have been placed in whatever country they're living in. It is very often that the Jewish part of town is in like a border place between who that society sees as like the most undesirable and who has the power, right? Because it's like put Jews in the middle so they can like sometimes literally act as a buffer to war, and sometimes they can just act as like a societal buffer, right? And so it's useful to also think about that power piece, because it helps us think about like who the actors are in that moment and who has control in that moment.
That's really helpful. I mean, I can imagine sitting with one of my teenagers or another teen that I work with and kind of looking at that, that was put in the chat, prejudice plus power equals oppression, right? So if to kind of like identify something that they've come home and said, this happened at school today, or I heard this here, to help them analyze, okay, like what are the aspects in there that are prejudice and how you feel about it, which I can imagine feels like really awful. And where's the potential for harm? Like, what power do they have? Like, can we identify, is this actually something that we need to say, like, okay, we need to do something to make sure that you're safe? Or is there another way that we can think about helping you respond or not respond based on that second piece of the equation, right? The potential for the power that person may hold, and where then the risk and harm could be. My kind of understanding, right, how you talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think a lot about, right, how do we understand anti-Semitism as it's coming from a lawmaker versus when it's coming from a person with a large social media follower versus when it's coming from a teacher versus when it's coming from a friend in your classroom, right? All of those are instances of anti-Semitism, and how we understand what those people are capable of given their relative positioning also changes the ways that we can like disrupt and dismantle anti-Semitism.
And talking about disrupting and dismantling various forms of oppression, we know is something that teens are thinking about a lot. So like being able to use that language, where's the opportunity to disrupt and dismantle? I also am just thinking about to that last question, or that last point you just made, as well as something Oren was talking about in terms of isolation. I know you talk a lot and do a lot of education around working in collaboration with building, I can't think of the word at this moment.
Coalition.
Coalition, thank you. It started with a C.
Yeah, there we go.
How does that fit in here? What does that mean in terms of helping our teams think about being in coalition and not being isolated from others in this moment?
Yeah, right. So I think a central part of thinking about this is thinking about, I often talk about this and like the graciousness we give and the graciousness we get, right? And I think back to the summer of 2020 and the sort of racial justice uprisings that we saw, and people wanting to do better around racism, or even in this moment as we see attacks on trans folks, people wanting to do better by trans folks, and not quite knowing and sometimes not getting it right. And we always want people to give us so much graciousness when we are reaching to be our best selves. And when we're working in coalition, when we are trying to build allies to help keep us all safe, right? I really like that idea of sort of like doing this in coalition. We also need to give the amount of graciousness that we get. And what that can mean is understanding when people mess up and are growing, and what that line is between when people mess up and are growing and when people are being intentionally harmful or malicious, and starting to like make space for that. And what I often offer people is like thinking when you're thinking about anti-Semitism in a space you're in, is the anti-Semitism you're experiencing a bug or a feature? Is it a bug in the ways that we have not rid society of any piece of oppression, right? When you're in these spaces, you're going to also see racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia and all of those things. Ideally, they're not central to what the movement is doing, compared to a feature, right? When we think about the folks that were marching, the white nationalists that were marching in Charlottesville and have marched in many places, their foundational idea is that like Jews are harmful and Jews will not replace us, right? We don't want Jewish people around. That's foundational. There's no having a conversation there. There is no educating them out of that. That is central to what they're doing. And I would offer that when you're in a space where you see anti-Semitism as a bug, reach for that graciousness. When you see it as a feature, reach for those people that you have been gracious to and who have been gracious back to you, right? Create that community to deal with the spaces where oppression is a feature.
That is incredibly powerful. And again, I'm thinking back to, like I said at the start, sometimes as a parent, I'm wearing like my kid's like advocate hat. And sometimes I'm wearing like, I'm there, bouncing ideas off of them and being there for them hat. Right. And so if, for example, my kid comes home and says something's been scheduled on Shabbat, for example, and I'm, do I go into like, what, like the school like does not want Jews there, versus can I sit and analyze with them, again, going back to what you talked about in terms of prejudice and power, right? What is actually happening? And also, is this a bug or a feature? And if it's like, okay, it was an accident, how are we going to approach and ask people to be our allies and be there for us so that we can be part of it? Or is this something this keeps systematically happening? There's something deeper going on. Therefore, it's a feature. And we actually need to go into kind of a different mode in terms of taking care of ourselves. That is very helpful. I want to ask you one last question. Again, I wish we could keep going on forever. Any last kind of takeaways that you think, suggestions you would give to parents and adults in terms of supporting teens in their lives around anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Your teens are their own person who are building their own political identities, right? And you might not always agree. We've all shared these different frameworks for anti-Semitism. We've all shared these different approaches. And so when you're having these conversations with your teen, you might find that your teen has a different line and a different understanding. And you know, what I offer, right, is that your teen is standing on the shoulders of giants. They're standing on your shoulders. And part of what that can mean, right, is when you stand on the shoulders of giants, you can see farther than the people ahead of you. And I would offer, like, approach that conversation with curiousness and with a desire to share, like, your values with your teen, your understanding of the world, your knowledge and wisdom, but also appreciate the knowledge and wisdom that they're bringing, that they've experienced in being a Jewish person in the world in this moment. And really, like, we don't want our teens to parrot everything that we say. We want them to grow up into, like, fully formed, thoughtful adults. And the way that we can do that is by treating them as, like, fully formed humans when they're teens. And so treating them with sort of the grace and the honor and the curiousness that we would treat anyone when we have a conversation about difficult things.
Thank you so much. And again, that then helps us assess, as the parent and the adult sitting there, is this a moment of, like, safety and risk that I do need to kind of, like, step up? Or is this a moment to help them kind of navigate for themselves and grow that? Thank you so much, Becky. I am now going to invite our last panelist, Jen Anilick, who has already been on here, helping lead this conversation with me. And again, Jen, here at Moving Traditions, is our director of our Kol Kolenu Teen Feminist Fellowship, and works a lot with teens who are concerned about making social change through a feminist lens in their communities. And Jen, thank you for being here. You've already shared a bit with us about what you bring to the conversation. So I want to dive straight into asking you, what framework do you use and do you find helpful in talking with teens about anti-Semitism and what they are seeing around them?
Sure. One framework I think can be helpful for teens is an analogy that I learned from Ben Freeman, who is an activist and writer and educator. He compares anti-Semitism to the boggart in Harry Potter. So I know that not everybody here is as much of a Harry Potter nerd as I am, so I'll explain. So the boggart is this, it's a magical character, or creature rather, that becomes the thing that the person in front of it fears the most. So for instance, if the boggart appeared before somebody who had a huge fear of spiders, it would become this gigantic spider. So in this metaphor, if we apply it to anti-Semitism, it means, so Jews take the shape of whatever a society fears or hates the most, meaning that anti-Semitism shapeshifts, it shows up in contradictory ways, and it often fits the zeitgeist. So if a society fears communism, for instance, Jews are communists. If it's socialism, Jews are socialists. And same goes for power, weakness, and so on.
That's a really helpful, definite, like, framework for thinking about anti-Semitism. And I also wonder how that it can also be scary to think about, how do I kind of defend myself or navigate around something that is constantly changing based on what someone else fears? Any tips or ways that you found that to be useful for the teens you work with to be empowered in what they are doing and seeing?
Sure. So I'd love to start with kind of how anti-Semitism affects teens'
Great.
identities. So setting the stage, we haven't touched on that much anti-Semitism online, which is a lot of where teens are encountering anti-Semitism. I actually turned there's a group of 5 Kol Kolenu fellows who have started a new teen board. They're super impressive and have so much wisdom. I asked for some of their advice before coming on here tonight. And they talked about how they're seeing it everywhere online, anti-Semitism. One of them shared a meme that was, greedy Jews want to take over Israel to expand oil empires. It's kind of all over the place. And they see anti-Semitism online. They have pressure to comment on every single post that they see. And also, they told me that they feel pressure to defend their Jewish identities and also defend and talk about their views on Israel very frequently. So it's a lot. And they find anti-Semitism to be isolating. So for teens who, especially if they're living not in predominantly Jewish spaces, super isolating. They might feel uncomfortable or unsafe sharing that they're Jewish. Might hide their Jewish star or not want to identify as Jewish. And they tend to internalize. Also, they told me that they internalize the messages that they're getting. So that's kind of setting the stage for what's going on for teens.
And back to that Bogart idea of like, there's a bunch of different fronts so that they're trying to like, wait, what am I actually responding to? So what was some of the things that they shared were useful for them in terms of what they wanted for support?
Yeah, so one of the things that is the most useful that many of them talked about was the idea of adults showing up and listening. So we find that in the Kol Kolenu Fellowship, giving space for storytelling, for teens to tell their first person experiences, and for adults to validate and really listen, not just nod and pretend to listen, but really listen to what teens are going through, what teens are experiencing. Oftentimes, young people aren't taken seriously, so they don't get that space to really be able to raise their voices. And in addition to that, one of the helpful things, first surveying the situation and seeing, are there any safety risks here? Like, adults do need to step in when there's an immediate safety risk. If there isn't one, and adults have surveyed the situation, the next step that they recommended was to help them advocate for themselves. So to kind of team up and have a conversation and talk about, well, ask the teen, what do you want to do? What are some ideas? Let's think of some ideas of actions that you can take, which is incredibly empowering to team up with a teenager and help them strategize for how to address the situation.
And I'm thinking, I mean, the things you've said so far really point back to a couple of the other things that have come up throughout. So first and foremost, they want us to sit and listen, and they want to be heard in just what they're feeling and experiencing, right? And then after we've done that for them, being able to have a conversation to help them unpack and identify and figure out what they have the power to do, which goes back to some of the great things that have been shared by our previous panelists, like different perhaps ways to think about, frameworks to help our teens have that conversation, go through what it is like is what I'm seeing something that I need to stand up to, need to ask for help in? Are there other ways to go about it? Is it even anti-Semitism? I think it is. How do I talk about it? And that's really, again, unless we've assessed as the adults who are there for them that there is like real immediate risk, then they need us to kind of to help them in a different way, but then to actually help empower them. That's really helpful. That's really powerful. And I'm thinking there's kind of two words that are jumping out to me from throughout the conversations, the sense of isolation and how that relates to anti-Semitism. So we need to really help our teens not feel isolated, to feel connected, right? And then also to feel empowered, because we talk about an aspect of this is power being taken away. So helping them find the ways that they do have power, and then also help them identify where they don't have power, what we can then do to help them.
Absolutely. And I think adults can also offer power, like the access to adult. There's some situations where adults need to take action, like whether it's saying something to the school administration or something else, like figuring out how do I lift up my teen and how do I helpfully use my power to team up with them.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, Jen. I also want to ask you a little bit. You start at the start of the conversation tonight. You mentioned your grandmother's story, and I know that for you that is particularly resonant in a couple of ways that you think about your work with teens, that I think is useful for everyone here. Would you share a little bit about that?
Sure, happy to. So every time that my grandmother told her Holocaust experience, she spoke to schools very often when she was alive. Every time she told it, it was difficult. It brought her back to what happened to her, but she kept telling it because she found it incredibly important to send the message that we need to stand up for Jews and we need to stand up for all people. And seeing her embody that kind of resilience and strength, going and speaking, even though it was difficult, I find it an incredible idea and message that I try and get across to the teens that I work with, cultivating inner strength, inner resilience. Also, she taught me about the importance of taking necessary risks in order to protect ourselves. So I wish I could tell her entire story tonight. I can't, but there were a couple of times throughout her experience where she had a choice to stay or a choice to leave, and she took the risk in the moment, and it helped her to survive. So I often think about what calculated necessary risks can I take, and can I empower teens to take in service of creating a better world for Jews and for all people. And finally, that being Jewish is so much more than anti-Semitism. So she, most likely because of her experiences, but possibly in spite of them, created a really meaningful life, meaningful Jewish life. And I think about that a lot, about how in order to address anti-Semitism, we need to be rooted in what's meaningful to us about this incredible tradition.
That's really beautiful. And, you know, those kind of things that you mentioned about building resilience and an inner sense of power, right? About and helping our teens learn to take risk, calculated risk. And finally, about feeling a sense of joy and connection to what it means to them to be Jewish. Those themes run throughout our programs, and is very much actually what we believe teen wellness is all about. So the fact that you can kind of identify those through how we can do that even in the midst of talking about anti-Semitism is really powerful. It is important for our teens to feel connected to the joy that they feel about why and how they're Jewish, in order to then say, okay, when there's something that is really scary because of that, we can connect back to that, and that can keep us going. That's part of that resiliency, and it's part of feeling connected. So on that note, we are getting close to the end, and I actually wanted to, well, let me ask if you have any last things that you want to say related to any of that, final tips before we bring everyone else back.
Sure. A couple of things that I'll share, and I think we're going to talk about this more in a bit, is so the teens that I talked to also, one of the recommendations was to look at some Jewish traditions that you want to introduce into your family. So they talked about start doing Shabbat dinners together as a family, for instance, and some other ideas could be to try out some new rituals, learn about Jewish history. There's so much incredible Jewish history, and learn about Jews all over the world. There's just a lot to learn and see within our tradition.
And the teens that you asked for advice on how they wanted to be supported around anti-Semitism, that's part of what they said.
Was part of their advice. Yep.
That's amazing. Let's have Shabbat dinner. Let's learn about our history. We want to feel that joy and connection. That's really beautiful. Thank you, Jen. On that note, I'm going to actually ask that Oren, Rabbi Frisco, Becky join us back here. And we've got about 5 minutes left. So I am going to do two things before I turn it over to the, we're going to do one last round robin with some final words from each person. But I am also going to say that at the, as we wrap up, we're going to share a couple of things in a chat. We're going to close with a slideshow, but we're going to go straight into that after everyone here has their chance to speak. It's going to include a link to a survey to share with us your feedback from tonight. And as part of participating in that survey, you'll have the chance to be entered into a drawing to win one of 5 copies, advanced copies of Rabbi Frisco's book. We need to talk about anti-Semitism. And it's also really helpful for us if we can get your feedback. We will be sending out in the next couple of days, when the recording is fully put together, you will get a recording from tonight, and you will get a couple of links. What Jen mentioned, the advice from the teams that she works with, that will be included in there, as well as many of the things discussed tonight, discussion questions based on some of the things that you've heard that you can use. So please be on the lookout for that. And then I'd like to close by going around one last time. We'll go in the order of our panelists. So Rabbi Frisco, then Oren, then Becky, and then Jen. I'm going to ask you to share 2 things. One thing that brings you joy in just a sentence about being Jewish right now. And the second, one really concrete tip that you want to leave the parents here tonight, that you think is important for them to take away. So, Rabbi Frisco.
Sure, thank you so much. And I'm so, I learned so much from all the other presenters. Okay, first, a concrete suggestion. There are so many, but I'll use the image Oren talked about being a very small group in a giant empty stadium. That's what we are now. We're around 2% of the population of the United States, 0.2% globally. We are like a statistical anomaly, a rounding error, just this really, really, really tiny group of people. And if we want to be protected and celebrated, we can't do it alone. It will not work if we keep this problem in the Jewish community only. So my concrete suggestion for everyone on this webinar is to tell their Jewish story to one person, to find one ally in the non-Jewish world that will listen, be compassionate, tell them what your teen is going through, tell them about your anxiety and your nerves and your confusion and your frustration, and let them be there for you. That is my concrete suggestion. Joy, what do you have? Another few hours?
In 30 seconds.
Right. I mean, let's see. Joy is this past weekend, celebrating a bar mitzvah and having candy go all over my sanctuary and being together. That's it.
Thank you. Oren.
Man, I've got so much joy. I work on anti-Semitism and abortion all day long, and I'm an endlessly joyful person. One, I just want to build on what Becky's personal story and say that part of what I love about being Jewish is that the story of the Jewish people is the story of all people, because our community is so rich and so diverse that, and I don't think we hear those stories enough to fully recognize and appreciate that. I'll say my son Noah Lincoln just turned 2 on Friday, so that's joyful for me as well. And my concrete tip, one of the things that I think your teenagers, your children need to understand, especially when it comes to dealing with anti-Semitism, whether it's online or in their social circles, especially when it comes to conversations about Israel, is that their job is not to defend harmful policies of the Israeli government vis-a-vis the Palestinian people or anybody else inside of Israel proper, or any of the politicians. What is important, to the rabbi's last point, is to nurture compassion and build empathy for the concerns of the Jewish people, which include our relationship to that land, those people, that state, and why so many of us feel a deep connection to it and feel a necessity for it to exist in a world of nation states. Their job is not to defend the Israeli government, but to deepen understanding for why so many in our community feel connected to it, despite our own challenges with what we see happening.
Thank you. Becky.
Okay, I'll start with the concrete tip, which is, as parents, you have to sit with your own relationship to anti-Semitism in sitting with your child's relationship. So doing the work to understand your values, how you talk about it, what combating anti-Semitism means to you. You got to put on your oxygen mask right before you put on your kid's oxygen mask. And then a moment of joy. I had a really beautiful moment with my 6-month-old daughter this weekend, a really important personal moment, and saying the Shehecheyanu in that moment and getting to having a prayer on my lips to thank God for bringing us to this beautiful moment. Is I always love it when I have a moment and a second to say the Shehecheyanu.
Beautiful. Jen.
Sure. Concrete tip for parents and adults who work with teens. Think about, when was a time that you encountered anti-Semitism and you stood up to it? And when was a time when you encountered anti-Semitism and you chose not to stand up to it? Take a bit to reflect on that and share it with the teens in your lives. Be authentic, share what you're struggling with, and then listen. As I said earlier, really listen to what they're experiencing and what their thoughts are. And some joy. I have been, each Shabbat have been trying to carve out and think about what rest looks like for me. And so this past Shabbat, I decided to spend some time with a really good friend having brunch. And then I went to a writing workshop, and it was this perfect container of rest and connection and generative reflection.
Thank you. Well, it is a joy having been on here with all of you and learning from all of you. Thank you very much. I know we're a couple of minutes over, so I'm just going to say thank you everyone who joined us tonight. And and for sharing your questions in the chat. And we hope to see you at our next webinar.